is widely accredited with the evolution of this term of hybridity, taking it away from that sort of biological state to mean the clash of two cultures and how they merge together and produce new elements. So he wrote about hybridity since about the 80s and the 90s is when he starts coming up with these talks about mimicry and things. It comes into the peace and conflict field 2006, 2007, 2008 is when it sort of really sort of proliferates. And then you have 3 or 4 years of people repeating all the same critiques against hybridity that were happening in the post-colonial discourse, you know, a decade beforehand. Not realizing or not taking that on, because when they critiqued hybridity, they didn't critique Bubba, they critiqued Richmond, or they critiqued Kevin, or they critiqued someone else who was writing about it in the peace and conflict field. So there was this weird isolation where we were just sort of repeating all these same critiques that had already been resolved, and you know, you could either find hybridity useful or not, depending on whether or not it was a good lens for you. So transmission of ideas across disciplines. I mean, that's something that Richmond has sort of built his career off, is going into these other disciplines, taking an idea from urban development or something, and bringing it in to peace building studies. It's really, really great. But it's not great when other people only quote Richmond rather than the people that he's drawing on as well, because then we get this sort of half-hearted idea which only has part of the appeal and part of the sort of function. The last point I wanted to make in terms of the cyclical nature of debate is the point of empirical studies. Empirical studies are great, going into a country and saying, well, this is how this has happened in this particular context. It's fantastic. But when 10 people do it 100 times and they just go from country to country looking at the exact same thing, but they don't bother to critique any of the bigger international elements, it becomes very, very repetitive. So if anyone's going to do a study like this, make sure that you don't read empirical work, because that is very, very boring. So, to conclude on that sort of part then, the limits of criticality. So as they emerge within my data set, critiques of the academic paradigm are frequent. So what I mean there is critiquing how we think about the world happens a lot. Academics love challenging each other. Critiquing the actual international order in terms of what we're interpreting doesn't happen as often. Very, very scant. Critiques of peace building still believe in the possibility of peace building. Now that's nice. You know, who doesn't want to believe in peace building? But the problem is we don't really have anybody not believing in peace building. So the conversation, instead of being like this with a I hate peace building, I love peace building, and people in the middle, it's just everyone's sort of here, you know, and that's fine, but it doesn't help produce new theories, it doesn't help produce new thoughts. That sort of Socratic method of challenging things that we ourselves actually believe in isn't really occurring that much, which I think is probably reducing sort of the limits of imagination. There's a very good reason for that, though. It's because of sort of geopolitical powers, and you know, if someone says, oh, what happened here in Bosnia was rubbish, then Russia picks it up and says, well, we can't do that, and that was bad. So there are reasons to each of these things, but I still think we should, for the sake of argument, occasionally expand out what we're critiquing. Critiques of peace building are of the operationalization rather than the objectives. So we are coming up with all these fantastic new ways to do peace building, but what we're actually trying to create from peace building, we haven't thought about for a wee while. Critiques of peace building are primary problem solving rather than critical theory. Basically, no real alternative orders have been laid out. I did chase up academics on this. I asked all 40 of them, what alternatives exist? Where are, you know, the things that we could be doing instead? And I think there is this bias where we're all part of this liberal order, or all of the people that I was speaking to, and they really didn't want to challenge it that much to the point that it would actually transform everything else. So some of the explanations. I mean, this is the total amount of articles within my data set. I put it in the back there just because we are getting more critical, or more people are writing on that field, or there's more peace and conflict scholars, or there's more people that went to academia and then couldn't get a real job and had to do a PhD. Either or, there's a lot more people writing and publishing articles now which are using critical thoughts and critical concepts of peace building, which is great. It's fantastic. But why haven't we really produced much sort of revolutionary change outside of this sort of paradigm critique in terms of challenging these policy objectives? So the first sort of thing I came up with was academia doesn't seem to be the place for this type of critique. So the scholars that I talked to about, why haven't they spoken about violence? Why did the UK only stop selling, well, pass a bill to stop selling guns to Sri Lanka 2000 and now? Actually, it was a couple of weeks ago, I think. A bill got passed along the table saying, oh, we should stop selling guns to these countries. They are dangerous, despite the fact that, The Guardian reported on it 2011, 2012. And so a lot of these academics said, well, we are aware of all of these issues, but academia is not the place to have these discussions. So I've got a blog. Did you read my blog? I tweet about this. I put it on Facebook. I'm part of this tea society, and we have book discussion about it, every second week. It's great. But these conversations aren't getting out into academia, into the discourse. And there seems to be this idea that a published article is for objective scientific research rather than sort of rhetorical, flamboyant critique, which is understandable because we're competing with these sort of neoliberal institutions which want to be able to measure us. And it's a lot easier to measure something if it has numbers in it. There's also this notion of democratization of knowledge, which is basically there's a lot more people producing research articles, there's a lot more think tanks, there's a lot more NGOs and stuff that are competing with this space. Academia doesn't hold a monopoly to the legitimacy of expert knowledge, and in fact we're barely ever called upon, and most academics don't think we influence policy at all. But still we're competing with all these other things and trying to have our voices heard. On the assumption that we're better and more right than them, that's probably a bad thing. There's the notion of co-option and obfuscation, so the idea that as a critical theory becomes more mainstream, as more people start drawing on it and using it, it loses its emancipatory zeal, it becomes less critical. And that has been happening with quite a few of the theories that I looked at in the data set. The more they're reproduced, the less they actually have that original normative intent within them. And the more they sort of seem to just buttress the status quo again. Harlene's preference, well, that means sort of that metrics, the articles, the PBRF, it's called here, RAF in the UK, it's called something Swedish in Swedenland, and something Norway-ish in Norwegian land. We all have them, all our systems, all our universities have these ways of reporting and ranking and judging academics. Some people think it's great because academics need to be managed because, look what happens when they're not. But others think that, it stops imagination, it stops big questioning and development, because you have to publish in a 4-star journal, which means you have to target your writing and your work to specific things to make sure that you still have a job next year. In fact, I managed to sneak a photo of this on one of the academics' walls when they're a little bit intoxicated. And this is from the higher-ups of the university of saying, how do we make an exceptional contribution? And I love the ones down here. Counter-orthodox or majority orientation opinion to a topic. Just counter it. It doesn't matter if you're right. Just critique it and say it's wrong, and we'll see how far we can get. I mean, that's fantastic because you get a cool publication of it, and then everyone hates you for it, and so they all reference it. Within my data set, Roland Paris's At War's End was referenced something like 200 times. It was the most referenced text in the data set. No one likes that book. They're all referencing against it because Roland Paris is all about doing things sort of, he was critical when he wrote the book, but now it's seen as too much top-down, it's seen as institutionalization before liberalization. So before people have their rights and freedoms, we need to build up the society around them that can control it. So everyone referenced it, but they weren't referencing it because they like it. They were referencing it because they thought it was bad. And it just became this weird punching bag where, you're countering an orthodox or majority opinion, which is fantastic. Undesirability of considering the impacts of governmental power upon ourselves. I asked every single academic whether or not the REF and the PBRF and all these different things impacted their ability to write. Did they ever feel as if they hadn't been able to write something that they wanted, that it had to be changed, that an editor applied pressure to them? No. Everyone said no. Not me. Could see how it could happen, but not me. which is really cool because I was really worried that those sorts of things would have a bigger impact on people. That, you know, if your boss is saying you can't write that, you might listen to your boss. But either they're wrong or I was wrong. I don't know how one would prove that. But I mean, I think the notion of governmentality is that it's a lot more subtle. And just by looking at the limits of critique that I've sort of pulled out, what things aren't being questioned, what things aren't being challenged, I would say they are being influenced by this. I would say that everyone is being influenced by this a lot more than we care to admit. And I think a lot of these academics need to think about that more and think about what sort of things that they can't write. Big books, things that just talk about nothing for hours. I mean, academics are good at it, and we write a lot of it, but why not start using imagination and challenging and being radical instead? So to what extent do academics want to challenge the order in which they're actually situated themselves? To what extent is someone like Oliver Richmond actually challenging the liberal peace? I mean, he says that we need a new state, but he also says that there will be some form of political order that will look like a state, and that the state is a really good mechanism for stopping violence. So how much does he actually want to change the state or violence or its monopoly of violence? It's unclear from his writing because these sort of biases aren't brought out. So that's what I want to sort of end on, is how can we go forward? Well, some people said read more political theory. And I think there is an actual point in that. And within the data set, within what people were referencing, very, very minor amount of sort of historical texts of political theory. And you know, we don't need to look to the past every time to create something new, but I think that a lot of the discussions that these sort of more problem-solving critiques are having have been discussed, and they're not drawing on these questions and these larger problems. There's the promise of teaching blogs and public engagement. This is a good one. Is most academics said that the more critical stuff, you know, they're doing it in the blogs, but also in the classrooms. So make sure, you know, you're being as radical and as challenging within the classroom as you can. I mean, if people still read blogs, that's cool. And otherwise, public engagement, so discussions and advocacy and things like that. But those are all other conversations about whether academics should be advocates or whatever. I think they should, is my bias. Reflection of what academia is and what it should be. I asked every academic, who are they writing for? Who are they challenging? What do they hope to contribute to? Weirdly enough, the people that were the most critical in my data set were the ones who said that they were just doing it out of pure intellectual curiosity, whereas the ones that were most invested and wanted to help others and noted that as something that they wanted to do, they were the least critical, which makes sense from the point of view that they want to stop the violence as quickly as possible, and we'll figure out the rest later. Resistance against the neoliberal institution of academia, this is a really, really important one. So definitely, Aidan's filming, so I won't say that. But just, yeah, do that. And resistance against publishing houses as well. So one sort of discussion that's been happening is the re-emergence of university-owned publishing press, creating its own journals and books and things like that. Otago University has one, our centre has its working paper series, you know, but using alternative outlets rather than Taylor and Francis and things, which are horrific monstrosities, which hopefully will still employ me if I need that as an option. But that control and really limit not only our access to thought and knowledge and theory, but the sorts of questions that are happening. And this sort of editorialship in the way that it controls discussions, and they create one idea, it's popular for a while, and then they flip it, and everyone runs to that side and critiques the same thing. Other people have documented this, and it's pretty fun. Sorry, that's another